So as you can see, this is a little bit different from my usual sketchbook tour type videos or even just my like live sketching ones. I am in the process of working on a new sketchbook though. But I thought it would be neat to document my sculpting process for this little project of mine. Mostly as a kind of diary, but also because, I don't know, maybe you guys want to see how I made this sculpture as well. Probably about a year ago, I kind of fell down the rabbit hole on YouTube of watching like anime figure unboxing videos as well as like figure just collection tours. And honestly, this really sort of inspired my own collections, which I did end up picking up several more figures during the whole, I don't know, creating process. So I think it was because I was watching these figure videos that I started to get like sculpting videos also recommended. Basically people just making fan art of just their favorite show or movie but in 3D form. So whether it was clay or recycling garbage, which is like really sick, to create just objects from movies and even original stuff too. But for me specifically, I kind of wanted to make a fan art piece. Honestly, a lot of these videos brought up a good point that if you want something, why not make it yourself? Once like the, I don't know, creative cogs were working in my head, I'm like, well, what do I make the fan art of? Like, what do I even do? And then I remembered. And I had a really specific scene in mind. So beautiful. And I also knew exactly where I was gonna put it. First of all, yes, I am a pleb. I have like no screen recording software, but essentially I will be sculpting this image here with Jen on the top and the crystal below him. After watching a bunch of YouTube videos for research, I kind of felt secure in what I was doing, even though I haven't sculpted before or, you know, used any of these materials I'm about to use before. But I started to compile a list of all the materials I was going to need. And it was a lot. So I would need clay, silicone mold, a wooden plaque, sandpaper, something to mix the silicone in, gloves, goggles, acrylic resin, acrylic paint, and a few more stuff that I ended up picking up that I didn't write down here. But either way, it's a lot of materials. Honestly, at this point, I was kind of just considering like, why don't I just buy like a pre-made figure? But anyway, before I did anything else, I first did some conceptual sketches. So basically before I could start anything, I had to plan out what I was gonna do. The first thing I did was start to plan out what size I was gonna make the crystal. So I ran through these two different sizes here. I think this is the one I ended up going with, but these were my original sort of test shapes, and I would hold this up to the location that I was wanting to put this project when it's all finished and just see how it fit. I started just taking notes about the different tools and equipment I would need in order to make this, and pretty much the layout of how it would look on the base here that would be made of wood. But as you'll see later, I didn't actually end up going with that. So with my research of watching YouTube videos done and the concept designs laid out, it was time to make the crystal. Before the resin version of the crystal could be made, I needed to make a clay version to make the mold from. So at this point in the project, I wasn't actually sure if I was going to make a video or not. And so because of that, I didn't actually get any footage of the sculpting of the crystal. I do have this photo though. So that aluminum is basically just the armature for the clay to form around it. The armature that I created actually does become helpful later in the project as well for other things. And so I actually still have it. My dad actually helped me, which was really nice of him to insert this bolt into this wood to really hold it up because I was worried it would, like, you know, be too heavy and topple over. And this is what I was left with. This is the clay version of the crystal. I might paint it, but we'll see. Used for the crystal was this DOS paper clay, and it worked pretty good. It's like an air dry clay. It's definitely kind of fragile though. So when it comes to Jen, I'm going to have to find a different clay. But now that I have this sculpted clay crystal, I can now go and make the molds. I needed to quickly put a layer of clear coat over the crystal just to make sure that the plaster doesn't stick to it or do anything weird during the casting process. For the molds, I was going to use silicone and do a sort of like create a kind of container that I would put the crystal in the middle of and then pour the silicone on into it. But then I looked at like the insane price of silicone for that specific volume that I needed, and it was just crazy, man. So like decided to use plaster instead. And this also seemed pretty doable to me. The only downside was that I'll have to end up with 2 halves of the crystal, and I'll have to somehow figure out a way to make them one crystal without like a really ugly seam showing through. So I picked up some plaster and I was ready to go. So the one half of the mold that ended up growing mold, I washed down with a bleach mixture. I hoped that would clean it off, and it seemed like it did, so I was going to go ahead and use that mold anyway. Now, at this point in the project, I had to kind of take a break from the crystal portion because the resin needs to be used at a temperature of like 70 to 80 degrees. And at that time, I want to say it was like February or something, so it was not going to get that hot outside anytime soon. Also, resin needs to be done in a well-ventilated area, so I wanted to do it outside. But I was getting some free time from school during spring break, and that was the perfect time to work on the other half of the project. I'm pretty new to sculpting, so this next part was a little daunting. I had just finished sculpting the crystal, so it wasn't like I'm like super fresh at sculpting, but honestly the crystal is a lot simpler than making a full-on costumed character. Let's get sculpting. after all the sculpting was finished, I could finally get to something that I actually know how to do, painting. Oh, you guys, okay, it was finally warm enough to start working with the resin. So it's time to be serious, because resin is very serious business. So originally I was going to use these acrylic paints to dye the crystal, but for reasons, we'll be using these instead. Okay, I don't know why I made that so weird, but the reason that I didn't use the acrylic paints is because they would have been too opaque, and I'm trying to get a look that is transparent. Just clearing that up. So it kind of like didn't work. And I kind of have like a little clip of my, I want to say reaction, but this is kind of what it looked like. It seems like what happened is that the resin actually seeped into the plaster itself, but that wasn't like the only problem. The alcohol inks that I used, it turns out that pink alcohol ink turns brown a lot of the time. It seems that it does that because of the way resin heats up in order to harden, that it literally just like burns the pigment. Which honestly, that really sucks. So even if the mold worked, the color would have been brown and gross and I wouldn't have been able to use it anyway. There was some good to come out of this failure. Alright, so I have decided to scrap the last idea. Obviously. That first mold was just not going to work. So at this point I'm going to have to get more resin and rethink how I'm going to attempt to make the crystal again. Because I honestly, I could go back and just paint the clay version, but it's not going to have the contrast or the transparent look that I'm really going for. A little while back, after I started the project, I found out that they actually make silicone for this very, I don't know what to call it, like technique that I'm using, and it's this one. Part 2 of mold making will be attempting to use this brushable silicone. This is probably what I should have got in the first place, but at that time, I think it was in January, I think, when I was planning this out, I went the plaster route. Clearly that didn't work, so hopefully this stuff works better than the plaster, because at least this silicone is sort of made for resin projects. Before I try any of this out though, I'm gonna have to go and fix the crystal because it got damaged during the plaster making. So let's go do that. So for some reason, it was like super hard to find a cheap plaque that wasn't like $10 at my craft store or even online. Finally, my local craft store got them in stock. So in the original design, I was going to put the symbols from the show below the crystal and basically kind of just fully recreate the room that the Crystal of Truth is held in. But as I got along in the project, I wanted to keep it more as like a classy figure and less like a diorama. Not that there's like anything wrong with making a diorama, it's just like that's not really like the look I'm going for, you know? I also wasn't going to keep the plaque plain, even though I'm not doing any like sculpting on top of it. So I had to do a little bit of prep work. It's not appropriate. Finally, another warm day came, so I was ready to do resin pouring. Take 2. just pulled the crystal out of the mold and it's a little rough on the outside, just some like texture issues, so I'm gonna go get some sanding tools and just clean it up. Got the crystal all sanded. It's really smooth, which is really satisfying to touch, honestly. But I ended up creating a bunch of holes during the molding process. So I think what I'm gonna do is wait till it gets warmer outside, because right now it is, I don't know, it's basically winter. But I think going over the top with a thin layer of resin as a sort of top coat and then sanding that down and even at the edges will just hopefully fill in these holes. If it doesn't, maybe I'm wasting my time, but I've already attempted so many different things with this crystal and it's already failed sort of once. So let's go and give that a shot. With my brother, I put the finishing touches onto the base. Oh my god, you guys, here he is. I hate this. I don't like recording holding him. I'm so glad he's done. I don't have to think about this project anymore. I started planning it back in October and it's June now, so he's taken a crazy long amount of time. Like, obviously there was gaps in between, but you know, still. There's one thing that I would like change if I ever attempted this project again, is that I wanted it to glow, and because I ended up using the pigment powders, they're a lot more opaque than the alcohol inks, so the light doesn't shine through as well. All in all, I feel like I maybe made this whole thing a little more complicated than it needed to be, especially with how many times I messed up and things went wrong, but I guess that's how, you know, you learn to do stuff, I guess, is by messing up. But other than that, I'm pretty happy with him, and I love how he looks on my shelf with my other figures. It still feels so magical. It's like having the, you know, the scene of the movie with me all the time. I don't know. So with that being said, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you on my next video, which probably won't be a DIY because they take a very long time, and plus I don't really know what else I would make. Bye.